Although many of you in the audience might be familiar with the Duvernay as a generalized concept, I felt it was important to look at the greater Kaybob area in the context of the larger open seaway that preceded the deposition of the Duvernay. And I hope to be able to show through this presentation how the interpretation of the depositional environment of the Duvernay is strongly influenced by these paleo environments. Before we begin, I'd like to walk through the various pieces of data that I've used for the purposes of this talk. In particular, the stratigraphic component, the nomenclature, will come from the Alberta Geologic Survey's Open File Report from 2018. I'll be using a cartoon from Campbell et al. From 1992, which was a carbonate sequence stratigraphy exercise. I will also rely on the digital outputs from the 3D Provincial Geologic Framework that has been available since 2019. It's a great product. There's a YouTube video out, A Billion Years of Tectonism, that was created by the University of Adelaide, Collins et al. And I'm going to be using that to show the position of the environment at the time of the Duvernay-Leduc system being basically on the equator over a very short period of time, say around 10 million years. And then the mapping project was enacted using 5,300 plus wells that are on the right-hand side of the picture. You'll see a map with the Leduc complex, and the blue wells would be any well that has a Duvernay penetration. And I've broken it down into sort of three pieces: East Shale Basin in yellow, West Shale Basin in blue. West Shale Basin would be sort of the middle of the waterways sea previously, and then the Greater Kaybob Basin, which is the area in the upper left red that I will be talking more specifically about in this presentation. So a very important question to ask is, what did the paleo environment look like prior to the deposition of the Duvernay? To answer that question, we're looking at the waterways sea, which is part of the Beaver Hill Lake time, and the central picture is that it's a picture of Alberta, and we can see that the central feature of Alberta at the time of the waterway sea was a giant basinal shale encircled by fringing carbonate platform. In one instance on the right-hand side, which we'll call the eastern platform, we'll see that we don't have any data to the north. That's basically because there's some form of an erosional edge and we don't have it. But generally there's a good agreement that the Swan Hills platform encircles the waterways subbasin. The waterways subbasin is an argillaceous calcareous shale, which would suggest that it wasn't shallow enough to enact an opportunity for photic production of carbonate. Around the fringe, or what we consider to be shallower waters, that's where the carbonate platform builds, and on top of that carbonate platform, we also can infer Swan Hills reefs which have accumulated on top. So that's the basic paleogeographic position of the waterways. You can see that it's restricted to the west and the south. It's open to the north. You can also see from the upper right-hand corner that star sits basically at the equator. So we're at the equator at the time of the deposition, and this should set us up for what will happen next as we move into the Duvernay time. In position number 1 on the left-hand side, we have the original waterways basinal shale from the Beaver Hill Lake time. So we have Swan Hills carbonate platform, which would be in a photic position surrounding a non-photic argillaceous shale, and an open sea to the north. In position number 2 in the middle, you'll see that the Cooking Lake carbonate platform has migrated from the east to the west and has closed off the access to the open sea to the north, which then provides an opportunity for position number 3, which is the Majo Lake basinal shale, which now has geographically shifted its position from the east to the west. In addition, the Majo Lake has essentially flooded the pre-existing Swan Hills platform and is now in a new position, which will eventually show to be proximal to the dolomitic reefs of the Duvernay. So after Majo Lake time and that geographic shift in the basinal shale of this area, we begin to grow dolomite reefs along linear trends or lineaments, which begin to play an important part of the chemistry of the Duvernay itself. And so rather than it just being a carbonate platform, we actually are developing dolomitic reef systems throughout the time at which, at the same time, Duvernay was being deposited. In between item number 4 in the middle, which is the Duke system, and item number 5, which is just a continuation or the middle part of the Duvernay, I just wanted to show how the middle Duvernay carbonate, sometimes called the El Diablo, fits geographically right over top of the Majo Lake basinal shale. And in between that middle Duvernay carbonate and the Majo Lake is another economic reservoir called the lower Duvernay reservoir. I didn't put map up in here just for expediency's sake. I wanted to make sure that I had some time to go through the other mapping. So I'm going to show you the isopac map of the lower, but for the purposes of this discussion, I've removed it from the talk. And so we're going to look at the thickness of that Majo Lake. We're going to look at the thickness of the middle Duvernay carbonate, and we're going to look then at the next component, which would be the meat of the Duvernay development program, which is neither the carbonate nor the lower Duvernay, but the upper Duvernay reservoir. In this final triptych, we're going to look at the position of the middle Duvernay carbonate, which is exclusive to the Majo Lake position and thereby is not depositionally found in the East Shale Basin, to the position of the upper Duvernay reservoir, which is the middle of the slide in yellow, showing that the upper Duvernay reservoir is common in all 3 basins. So when I make a map of the upper Duvernay reservoir and then I add in the contours for thickness, the black lines being greater than 15 meters of upper Duvernay reservoir, you can see that all 3 basins have accumulations that are proximal to these growing Leduc reefs, and then would be capped ultimately by a very much larger Ireton basinal shale system that is the cap for the Duvernay itself. Moving on to the project from a mapping perspective, I just want to show a cartoon cross-section of A to A prime representing 2 areas, one called Guy and the other one is called Two Creeks. They're about 100 kilometers apart. You can see the lower left-hand map of the upper Duvernay reservoir, and again where I've used a dark line being greater than 15 meters of thickness. What we have and what we'll be mapping are 6 layers. The Majo Lake, which sits on top of the Beaver Hill Lake complex. That's the basinal shale we talked about. Then we move into the lower Duvernay reservoir in green. It's then capped by the middle Duvernay. The middle Duvernay is going to be interesting because in its thickest part, it represents a carbonate, which is non-productive. But as it thins up and moves towards the edge of where the reef systems are, you'll see that it transitions into a shale. So that whole carbonate to shale thing is quite unique to that particular layer within the Duvernay. Above that, in the yellow, is the meat of the sandwich. It's the upper Duvernay reservoir. What I've done for the purpose of this mapping project is to divide it into 2 layers. I actually have more than just 2 layers, but for the purposes of this talk, I want to specifically look at the G2, which is equivalent to some of the flooding surface material that other people have provided for their own stratigraphic interpretation of the Duvernay. But for my purposes and for these purposes, I'm just going to call two pieces of the reservoir, one above the G2 and one below the G2. And I'm going to show you the isopachs for both of those. And then we're going to look at the total thickness as well. So before we go into the greater Kaybob area, I just wanted to show that basinal Majo Lake isopach for the entire Duvernay fairway. And you can see again that the thickest part of the Majo Lake is found within the West Shale Basin, up to 45 meters of thickness. But as we move from that thicker part in the West Shale Basin westward and into the greater Kaybob Basin, you can see there's a dramatically thinner package of Majo Lake, and we're going to explore that in greater detail on the next map. So now all subsequent slides will be for the greater Kaybob area. The contours will be at 1 meter contour intervals, and hopefully you'll be able to get a sense of the thickness and thickness changes by using the isopach color scale I have on the right hand side. I've also incorporated lineaments into this presentation. As part of my abstract, I had a lineament map that spanned the entire Duvernay, and rather than complicating this particular talk with that, I've just decided to use just interpreted lineaments for the greater Kaybob area as we move and progress from isopach to isopach. So just wanted to show the Majo Lake isopach and its significant variability that occurs within this area, albeit at meter to meter scales. It's really fascinating to see how the changes occur as we move up into the greater Kaybob area from the West Shale Basin. We significantly thin, and we begin to see the effects of these lineaments on the depositional thicknesses accumulated for the Majo Lake. And before we leave the Majo Lake shale, I just wanted to show the Swan Hills reefs that were part of the platform that was drowned at the time of the geographic shift of the Majo Lake. So on top of the platform, we would have had additional reef buildups. They're the ones in the hashed blue areas, and the Majo Lake drowning this particular piece then shows the back step that has occurred to the position of where the Leduc reefs are, which are to the south now. So next up is the lower Duvernay Reservoir, and it's present largely throughout the area. It's up to 10 meters thick. On average, when it's thick, it's sort of in the 4 to 6 meter range. You can see, again, there's variations in thickness along lineament trends. It's an interesting economic opportunity in certain areas, and other areas, because of the thickness of that middle carbonate, it is separated from the upper and therefore probably not hydraulically stimulated in most instances. So here's the middle carbonate, middle shale isopach, and the star sits beside the blue part where the shale is. The shale would be located just proximal to the Sturgeon Lake Reef in this upper block within the overall system. But there's a big disparity between the thickness of the middle shale carbonate in that block relative to its immediate block to the south. That large triangular block in there has the thickest part of the carbonate section within the greater Kaybob area. As we follow from here to look at the upper Duvernay in its two pieces, the G above the G and below the G, I just wanted you to take a look and see what the net effect is on the way materials being deposited north and south of that particular carbonate platform. So when we look at the below the G2 isopach, one of the things you'll note is that where the carbonate below it was thick, the material from the below the G2 isopack is thin. And also there's a very significant increase in thickness to the south, as well as the thickness increase to the north, but not at the same extent. And finally, we have the above G2 isopack, again, a greater thickness to the south, but still deposition going on in all the blocks that sit around it. And then this would have been topped by the Ireton Shale. So that is all we have from the individual isopack layers. And now I'm going to show you the aggregates for the total Upper Duvernay reservoir and then the total Duvernay reservoir thereafter. So combining the above and below G2 to make the total Upper Duvernay isopack, we now have a map that really exemplifies the type of mapping that would be required from an economic perspective. And so I've used the 15-meter contour or 50-foot contour as a sort of a highlight to show where the accumulation of the Upper Duvernay reservoir exceeds 15 meters of pay. So when we add all of these layers together, we come up with a total Duvernay isopack, a reservoir at the bottom, a middle carbonate / shale, non-productive in the middle, and then the upper Duvernay on top. We begin to get a sense of the importance of the tectonic elements in the overall thickness of this greater Kaybob Basin. In the south, near the reef system, we have up to 60 meters of total thickness. And the overall lower southern block has an average between 60 to 30 meters of total thickness. And then we cross a north-south lineament in the middle of the block, where the Leduc Reef sits sort of alone in the middle, and we only have up to 30 meters of accumulation there. But the purpose of the map then is to show disparity even proximal to from one block to the next. There could be as little as in the upper left-hand corner. That triangle only has around 15 meters of total thickness. So 15 to 60 is a very significant accumulation change over a very, very short period of time. And lastly, I would be remiss in not at least explaining the location of where the land that B32 has acquired is. And I've placed it over top of the Upper Duvernay Reservoir. I've also included the Duvernay well tops in blue. And just to highlight one of the operators who operates in both the southern main part of the Kaybob and up into the Guy portion of the greater Kaybob area is a company called Hightech. And if you have any questions about their work or our work in this play, you can always contact me as the author, but also this information is available through our corporate website, www.b32exploration.com, and I will take questions, and thank you very much for your time.